This is the best thing I've ever written. It's called Children of Death, or Kinder des Todes in my ancestors' native tongue. Um, I worked on this for 23 years. I started it in 1995, just as I was finishing Overstory Zero. I started it back then, and I grew with it. It grew with me. The research was very difficult, but really that wasn't the hardest part. The hardest part was trying to understand the story itself, the nature of it, and to understand myself. My approach to it at the beginning was really kind of an ornery thing. I was looking for what has been withheld from me as a child. My folks lived in Russia for 100 years before they came to the United States. And they spoke German, my grandparents, and my father would talk to them in German. And as I was growing up in the 1950s, it wasn't a great time to be German, having been through 2 world wars and the shame of the Holocaust. And it wasn't a great time to be from Russia either, with McCarthyism and all of that. And so it was very difficult for me to learn. I was curious, and my curiosity was not satisfied. In the early 90s, back 93 I believe it was, I was at my mother's house, and I ran across this little book called Ethnic Heritage of North Dakota. And thumbing through it, there was a whole chapter in there about the Germans from Russia, who, to my surprise, made up 20% of the population of that state. So at that time I was freelancing, freelance writing history articles for the Southern Oregon Historical Society. They had a magazine called the Table Rock Sentinel, and so I was making a few $100 here and there writing for them, and I realized I finally I can do it. I can do this. I know how to walk into an archive. I know how to do research. I know how to write history. And so I jumped on it, at first just doing the research. And then as I finished up the 4th draft of Overstory Zero for Sasquatch books and popped it off, I immediately started working on the writing of Children of Death. 200 and something thousand words later, I managed to come up with these 35,000 words that actually tell the story the way it should have been told, the way I came to understand it. Because again, as Rilke pointed out in Letters to a Poet, certain things have to incubate within you. Women understand this. You bring children to term. And it's the same thing with these stories, these ideas, these poems, these things. You grow with them. So 23 years of that. And finally last January I finished the manuscript on this in a blind hurry. It only took me a couple of months. Once I understood the underlying nature of the story, once I understood the emotional effect that I wished to produce, then I was able to select from what I had been writing for the last 23 years. So I'm very pleased to be able to present this to you tonight. They left Alsace in 1810. My great-great-great-grandfather was a landless laborer, and he pulled up his family and was part of a mass migration on a a few mass migrations my family's been through in the last couple hundred years, driven by circumstance, for the most part. So, the book goes back and forth between the history and also involves my own search for the story. So I will begin with a little passage called Day Trip. I went to Europe in 1996, searching for all of this. Each of the chapters begins with a proverb, an Alsatian proverb. There's something wonderful about proverbs. They encapsulate so much of a culture. It's a great entryway into another culture. So, for Day Trip, this particular chapter, Auf der Erde baue ich, auf dem Himmel trauere ich. They love these rhymes. I build on earth, I trust in heaven. Once I was alone in Strasbourg, where the oldest part of the city lies on an island in the Rhine. I'd come by train as a tourist with time to kill and curiosity to satisfy on a little day trip. At least that's how I explained it to myself later on the train after I'd decided to go. I went feeling adrift, unsure of who I was or why. Worn by weeks of travel in foreign lands, overwhelmed by strange sights and incomprehensible languages, and the effort to see and to remember what I saw. I was homesick, tired of my own company, yearning for an end to my sojourn. I went not knowing what I'd find in the ancient city, vaguely hoping to see some faint trace of my forgotten ancestors, a glimpse into their world. The island has served as a trading center, administrative capital, and fortress since Roman times. It has endured while the empires which seized and lost it came and went. Plague, famine, and war washed over it repeatedly. Here, I knew the world had ended many times and been renewed many times. I came to a cobbled square near the center of the old city where the lovely Gothic cathedral, built of rose-colored sandstone blocks, rises. Later, I learned that it is 600 years old and took 150 years to build. Despite its massive size and the stubbornness of stone blocks, it does not overwhelm you with unfriendly bulk, but draws you to its warmth and complexity. The intricate details of ornamentation seem natural and perfectly in tune with its towering scale. Like a mountain, the worn building unfolds, playfully revealing itself in the changing sunlight and shadows, in sculpted forms, large and small, each part contributing to the whole. They built lovingly and well, those long ago people. I was proud of them, proud of their patience, their skill, their sense of proportion, their humble audacity. Some of the builders, at least, were probably Alsatian ancestors of mine, for the further back you trace it, the more ancestors you'll find. It's certain that some of the people whose blood I carry had walked in this square and prayed in this place. Inside, the cathedral was dark, the walls stained by a generation of votive candle smoke, and the feeling of a long, continuous human presence was palpable. Some of the tourists seemed oblivious, as though it weren't a church still in use, day trippers dutifully seeing one more site on the checklist. But most were quiet, aware that they were in a place made holy by unimaginable centuries of human suffering and yearning. In a little side chapel, in the cathedral, I found an old wooden Pieta, Mary holding the body of her recently crucified son. I'm not a big fan of Gothic sculpture with its stiff poses and stylized portraiture, but this one overwhelmed me. The carver had somehow managed to use the restrictive conventions of his time to convey something hauntingly horrible and hauntingly beautiful and utterly human. The son was just a scrawny, ugly, broken and mutilated corpse. Human in form, but without a trace of personality or divinity. Only the final, impersonal inertness of death. Her face wore a mother's expression of profound pain, sorrow, regret, and compassion. The two figures told in the old story, one more ancient than the event it portrayed, and one that the carver had surely seen played out in his own time, for only direct experience could inform such masterful work. I'd seen the same tableau myself in news footage from Bosnia, Chechnya, Afghanistan, Iraq, and South Vietnam. The horror and finality of the corpse, the crushing grief, were the same in old black and white photos from my father's war, and in video clips from famine-ravaged Sudan, the debris-strewn streets of Belfast, Oklahoma City, and Beijing. Here, in a side chapel of a sandstone cathedral on an island in the Rhine, there was nothing I could do except to light a brief candle and pray. My family's a farming family. We've been growing wheat for a very long time. Something that I haven't done, but certainly my grandfather, my father. I remember asking my dad one time about why he had moved to Los Angeles. And his reply was, I didn't want to spend the rest of my life looking at some horse's butt. So my grandfather farmed with horses all the way up into World War II before he finally went out and bought a used tractor. He was born in Russia in 1886, learned his farming trade there, and he loved horses. He really did. Even once he had the tractor, he refused to actually drive the thing himself. He would send his sons out, and he'd hitch up a team, and he'd just go out and work the team. So that's what my dad did growing up, was driving team for his dad. I've never met a farmer who will admit to having had a good year. To hear it told, there are bad years and worse years, but never any good ones. It is a worrisome way of getting by, one with no assurances that you've made the right decisions. Every year is different, every crop dependent on whatever the soil, the weather, the insects, and the buyers might offer. Any year can see the sudden onset of plant and livestock diseases. A dark summer squall may bring hail, flattening the grain in a narrow strip only a few hundred yards wide, leaving a sharp-edged path of destruction that levels one field and leaves another just a few feet away untouched. Any two farmers, given the same set of chances, can make decisions that will bring a decent return to the one and disaster to the other. There is no way to know enough to make a safe decision. Prudence might be rewarded this year, or it might not. Following a hunch might save you when others are failing, or might plunge your family into generations of poverty while everyone around you prospers. Farming is as difficult to master as any of the other arts. It requires wholeness of vision and the ability to tolerate uncertainty, as well as courage, patience, discipline, and skill. If only it required an audience instead of a strong back, and was performed in 90 minutes instead of from sunup to sundown, 6 days per week for several months. County fair exhibition sheds would be as lavishly decorated as opera houses. I want to read from a chapter called Her Days. The proverb is Sishka mutet saar gibt edem kind varum, which means no matter how poor the mother, she keeps her children warm. There's a story in my family. We were back home one time there in North Dakota at Grandpa's farm. And my brother Tom got up one morning and there was Grandma there by the coal stove. And he came out, the little boy, and kind of rubbing his eyes and looking, and he saw her and he exclaimed, "Grandma never sleeps." In each household, the mother was always the first to rise and the last to go to bed. By sunrise, she'd already started the fire, nursed the baby, made breakfast, and packed a lunch for her husband and the older children to take along with them to the fields. The housework included not only sweeping and cleaning, washing and mending clothes by hand, baking and cooking, but also the farmyard chores of gardening, feeding the chickens and hogs, cleaning stalls and pens. There was never an idle moment in her day. What time she had to spare between the essential daily chores was spent spinning wool, weaving cloth and baskets, crocheting, knitting, darning, embroidering, making lace, soap, and candles. She would not sit still without something in her hands, even when taking time to gossip with her neighbors or teaching the younger children their prayers and nursery rhymes. Of course, she kept the children busy too, giving them tasks suited to their ages. The kids gathered eggs, helped feed and water the animals, weeded and hoed in the gardens, picked berries and gathered and stacked meat and brush for fuel. Meat is dried manure. This is dried cow patties, as people have used to burn that out on the Russian steppe where my ancestors settled for fuel, just as the immigrants on the Oregon Trail burned buffalo chips on their way out, because it burns nice and hot, as long as it's good and dry. There's something magical about women in how they can feed with loaves. There's something also about bread that is a magic too. And in that act of baking, a small miracle, something more than bacterium farts and gluten. There's something strong and mysterious about the whole process. Growing the wheat is straightforward, certainly. Plant a seed and watch it grow. But how is it that simple, such elemental foods as wheat flour, milk, eggs, salt, butter, and a bit of yeast turn into our daily bread, a sacred gift from God? I've watched the process since I was a child, even baked, but I still find it strange and unlikely. The sticky mass of gluey stuff will fluff up into a warm, light, aromatic, life-sustaining food that satisfies the soul as much as it does the belly. The ancestors, too, thought of it as a sort of small miracle, or a blessing at least. Into the holes the baker has baked his soul, they said. The big round loaves were always marked with a Christian cross cut into the top, done in part to allow the bread to expand, but also as a reminder of its sacred nature. The word itself, brod, was often used in their colloquialisms, as in the Lord's Prayer, to signify the necessities of life. The old German Russians were what is called nowadays a patriarchal society, with men holding most of the public economic and social power over their wives. Husbands physically dominated their wives in those times, back when corporal punishment of men, women, and children was thought to be essential to maintaining both domestic and civic tranquility. Yet, within her home and her marriage, a wife made most, if not all, of the family's decisions regarding child rearing, religious practices, meals, clothing, and other domestic arrangements. When we speak and think of pioneering in new lands, we nearly always speak of the masculine aspects of migration, picturing a man on horseback or driving a team and wagon, plowing the fields, hunting. What we seldom consider is their poor wives, uprooted from their homes and attempting to make a home in a temporary shack, bearing and raising children and nurturing the family in a new land among strangers. What role, if either, do you suppose required the more care, the harder work, the greater courage? Most men, I find, fear women. They have realized just how tough the cookie makers actually are. The German-Russian dialect, like nearly all other languages, contains many more pejorative words for women than for men. Hausdrache, which means house dragon. Hex, which means witch. Hure, whore. Such terms are never needed for those who are not feared. The journey from Alsace to Russia was about 1,200 miles and took a few months. This was back in 1810. The people nowadays, I think, don't really seem to appreciate, some of us seem to be absolutely blind to what it means to uproot yourself and your family and to travel far away. Every journey begins with a mixture of excitement and dread. When that journey is undertaken as a migration, the first day is especially haunted by loss. For weeks or months before that day, all the familiar sights are seen with new eyes, as though home itself had suddenly become a foreign place. Logic, with its assurances, is useless at such a time. The heart sees what the mind denies, that an old and dear friend is dying, a friend whom you've loved more deeply than you suspected, a friend who is both yourself and the proof of your having lived and loved. To leave the place where the bones of your ancestors are part of the soil is terribly hard, an amputation that can sometimes be fatal, for any number of reasons. Homesickness alone can be enough to kill you. People sometimes die from broken hearts. Cut off from the people and the place they knew and loved, they become sad, clinically depressed, overwhelmed by the challenges, and one way or another, by accident or by losing the will to live, they die. It takes a long time, usually 3 generations, to learn enough to survive in a new place. because so much of what you know when you arrive there is useless. Every place has its own possibilities and impossibilities. There are new people and plants and animals and soils and weather and diseases to contend with. You can't rely solely on your traditions in a place where you don't traditionally belong. I'm going to read a little short section from a chapter called Potemkin's Steps, which is there's a series of steps that come up from the harbor in Odessa, the city of Odessa, and it's named after Potemkin, the great Russian hero. At least with the communists, everybody had time, the in-tourist agent sighed, telling of the old days 5 years ago. People would visit. We went to concerts and talked about art, about poetry and music. Now we have no time. The children, they only want to learn to speak English and use computers. They know nothing. They don't care about anything but money. Everyone is too busy now. We must work always just to survive. And no one has time to talk, to enjoy life. Yes, I replied, nodding in sympathy. The rat race, it's terrible. The what? She asked. I looked away, embarrassed. Her office needed painting. The scarred wooden desks held no computers, no fax machines, no photocopiers. There was an old manual typewriter, a mechanical adding machine with a handle you must pull, a telephone through which every call had to be placed 3 or 4 times before making the right connection. She sat looking at me, her face deeply puzzled. We call it the rat race, I finally explained. We say that no one has time to be human anymore. Instead, we run around like rats, searching for crumbs of bread, trying to get to them quickly before the other rats find them.